They pack a bag, buy a ticket, and picture a few perfect days somewhere far from home. A ski slope in the mountains. A warm ocean at dawn. From a tourist boarding a lift with her backpack still strapped on, to a father and son gliding along a zip line in the jungle, each of these began as an ordinary holiday moment. What ties them together isn't bad luck or fate. It's how thin the line really is between a normal day away and one that never ends. Brooke Day was 22 years old, an Australian who had traveled to Japan for something she loved. On the 30th of January, 2026, she was at the Tsugaike Kogen Ski Resort in Otari, in Nagano Prefecture, one of the country's major snow destinations. For a young Australian, a ski trip to Japan is close to a dream. The powder there is famous around the world. People save for years to stand at the top of those runs, breath fogging in the cold, the whole white slope stretched out below them. Brooke was there to ski, to feel that rush, to take home the kind of trip you talk about for the rest of your life. That morning she went to board a ski lift, the same simple act every skier repeats dozens of times a day. You shuffle into position, the chair swings around behind you, and you sit. It is one of the most routine moments in the whole sport. But as she boarded, the waist belt buckle of her backpack caught in the moving lift carriage. It happened in an instant. The chair kept moving and the strap held her fast. She was dragged along the snow at first, unable to pull free. Then the lift did what it was built to do. It rose, and it carried her up with it, lifting her off the ground, leaving her suspended in mid-air by the trapped harness. In that position, with the strap pulled tight across her body, she could not free herself in time. She suffered a cardiac arrest while still entangled in the lift. Emergency crews responded and she was taken for medical treatment, but the cardiac arrest proved fatal. She died from her injuries. The mechanism was later documented as positional asphyxia, leading to cardiac arrest, caused by the way the lift pinned and suspended her. It is the kind of death that seems impossible until you understand how it works. The body, held in the wrong position, simply cannot draw breath, and the heart follows. Here is the detail that stays with you. Ski lifts are designed with safety bars and warnings. Signs at resorts tell riders to secure loose straps and be careful with backpacks precisely because of moments like this. Yet what happened to Brooke came from one of the most common tourist habits there is, boarding a lift with a pack still on your back. It was not a high-speed crash. It was not a fall from a great height. It was a low-speed, ordinary boarding, the least dramatic moment on the whole mountain, that turned lethal because of a single caught buckle. Brooke Day traveled to the other side of the world to do something she loved and lost her life in the space of a few seconds at the bottom of a lift. She was 22. If you're already thinking how easily this could happen to anyone, you're not alone. Subscribe and stay with me, because the next stories are just as hard to shake. Patrick Maguire was 67, an American who had come a long way to see the Scottish Highlands. In April of 2019, he was staying at a hotel near Inverness, in the north of Scotland, surrounded by the kind of scenery people cross oceans to photograph. Rolling green hills, cold, clear air, old stone buildings, and the quiet of a place that feels untouched by hurry. There is nothing safer sounding than a hotel garden. It is where you sit with a coffee, or a book, or just your own thoughts after a long day of sightseeing. That is what Patrick was doing. He sat down on a garden bench, a large metal one, weighing 72 kilograms, around 159 pounds. It was the kind of heavy, decorative furniture you find outside country hotels everywhere, solid enough that you never think twice about it. And then it tipped. The bench toppled over backward, and as it went, it pinned him against a wall. The impact knocked him unconscious. He was left trapped, in a bent-over position, held there by the weight of the metal, unable to move, unable to call out for help. In that folded posture, his body could not draw enough breath. He died from positional asphyxia, a form of suffocation caused entirely by the position his body was forced into. He was later found pinned and unresponsive. Emergency services attended, but by then it was too late. His death was certified as positional asphyxia due to the bench pinning him against the wall. The case was recorded as an unusual death, with the exact weight of the bench and the mechanism carefully noted. Positional asphyxia is a term you usually hear in very different contexts. It comes up in industrial accidents, in cases involving restraints, in situations far removed from a peaceful holiday. It is almost never something you associate with sitting down on a bench in a hotel garden. That is what makes this so difficult to absorb. There was no warning sign that could have prevented it, no obvious danger to avoid. It was a heavy piece of ordinary furniture tipping in exactly the wrong way, at exactly the wrong moment, with no one close enough to notice in time. Patrick Maguire came to Scotland to enjoy one of the most beautiful corners of the world. He died in a garden, in a place designed for rest, pinned by an object no one would ever think of as dangerous. He was 67 years old. Giulia Manfrini was 36, an Italian surfer with a passion that had taken her across the globe. On the 18th of October, 2024, she was in the water off the coast of West Sumatra, in Indonesia, one of the most celebrated surfing destinations on Earth. For serious surfers, this is holy ground. The waves there draw people from every continent, and Giulia was experienced, at home in the ocean, doing the thing she had built her life around. She was surfing offshore when something struck her. Not a wave, not a reef, but a swordfish. A large predatory fish with a long, spear-like bill that it uses to hunt. The animal collided with her in the water. Its bill pierced her chest, driven with enough force to inflict catastrophic internal injuries. It happened in open water, without warning, in the space of a single heartbeat. Nearby surfers and rescuers helped bring her ashore, and she was taken for medical treatment as quickly as possible. But the wound was too severe. She died from her injuries. Authorities recorded the cause of death as chest trauma from the swordfish's bill, and the case was documented as one of the rarest kinds of ocean fatality. A surfer killed not by a wave or a shark, but by a fish that simply happened to be moving fast through the same patch of sea. Think about the way we talk about danger in the water. When people imagine what might go wrong for a surfer, they picture sharks. Shark attacks dominate the headlines, the films, the fear. Sharks are the ocean's villain in almost every story we tell. Almost no one, boarding a flight to a surf trip, spares a thought for a swordfish. Yet that is what took Giulia Manfrini's life. An animal that barely features in any tourist's list of worries delivered a single, unsurvivable blow. It is a reminder of just how unpredictable the ocean can be, even for someone completely at ease in it. Giulia was not a first-timer who wandered out of her depth. She was skilled, seasoned, exactly where she belonged. The sea did not punish inexperience. It simply produced, in one fraction of a second, a collision that no amount of skill could have prevented. Giulia Manfrini traveled to Indonesia to ride some of the best waves in the world. She died doing what she loved most, struck down by one of the rarest hazards the ocean holds. She was 36 years old. Half Dome rises above Yosemite National Park in California like something carved by giants. Its sheer granite face is one of the most recognizable sights in America, and reaching the top is a rite of passage for hikers from around the world. The final stretch is the hardest and the most famous, a near vertical climb of around 120 meters up a set of steel cables bolted into the rock. You haul yourself up hand over hand, boots scrabbling on smooth stone, the valley falling away beneath you. In 1985, a group of 5 friends set out to make that climb. They were doing what thousands do every year, working their way toward the summit for the view that makes it all worthwhile. It is the kind of achievement people plan their whole trip around, the photo at the top, the sense of having conquered one of the park's great challenges. But Half Dome has another, darker reputation. The mountain has been described as essentially a huge lightning rod, a tall spike of granite that draws storms to itself. And on that day, a storm developed while the party was on or near the summit. High on the most exposed point of the tallest granite peak in the area, with metal cables running the length of the route, the 5 friends were caught in the worst possible place at the worst possible time. Lightning struck the group. 2 of them were killed instantly. The other 3 were injured, left stranded on an exposed summit in severe weather. Rescue on those cables is difficult and dangerous even in good conditions. In a storm, with the survivors hurt and the granite slick, park rangers faced an extremely hazardous operation just to reach them. The deaths were recorded as the result of a lightning strike at high elevation. To this day, that 1985 incident is cited in safety discussions about Half Dome as one of the clearest warnings the mountain has ever given. The metal cables that make the climb possible, the very thing that helps tourists reach the summit, also provide a ready path for lethal electricity. Yosemite warns visitors that mountain weather can change with terrifying speed and advises them to turn back the moment thunderstorms appear. But the summit is so close by that point, the goal so nearly reached, that the temptation to press on and just finish the climb is powerful. That is the cruel irony of Half Dome. It is a tourist magnet precisely because it is so high, so dramatic, so exposed. And those same qualities are what make it deadly when the sky turns. The reward and the danger are the same thing. The 2 climbers who died that day set out on an ordinary summer hike toward one of America's most beautiful views. The storm found them at the top. The cliffs of Moher, in County Clare on Ireland's Atlantic coast, are among the most photographed places in the entire country. They rise in a great wall of dark rock, in places up to 213 meters high, around 700 feet, with sheer drops straight down into the crashing Atlantic below. Buses arrive full of visitors every day. People come to feel the wind off the ocean, to stand at the edge of Europe, to take the kind of photograph that stops people scrolling. And that is exactly where the danger lives. The most breathtaking views come from the sections closest to the drop, and many visitors step beyond the designated paths to get them. They edge past barriers, closer and closer to the brink, to frame a better shot, or simply to look straight down at the water. On ground that can be wet, crumbling, or lashed by sudden gusts, the margin for error is almost nothing. A single slip, a stumble, a strong enough gust of wind, and there is nothing left to catch a person. Over the years, the cliffs of Moher have claimed multiple lives in falls. Some happened while people were taking pictures. Some happened in wet or windy conditions, when the footing was worse than it looked. The provided records do not name individual victims or count each case, but the pattern is well established, and it is grimly consistent. A fall from that height, onto rocks or into a churning sea, results in immediate or near-immediate death. Recovery operations are difficult and dangerous in their own right, involving coastal rescue teams and, at times, helicopter support along a wild and unforgiving stretch of coast. Irish authorities treat these deaths as accidents, tied to unstable ground, changeable weather, and the risks people take near unfenced edges. And here is the part that makes them so hard to sit with. There are warning signs. There are barriers along many stretches. The dangers are marked, plainly and repeatedly. Yet the very thing that draws people to the cliffs, That dramatic, dizzying edge is what makes a single misstep instantly fatal. The perfect view and the fatal drop are inches apart. No one who falls from the cliffs of Moher goes there intending to take a risk with their life. They go for beauty. They go for a memory. They lean out for one more moment of that astonishing view, trusting the ground and the wind to behave. Most of the time they do. And on the days they don't, there is no second chance, no time to correct the mistake, nothing between a wonderful holiday afternoon and a fall no one could survive. Miroslav Kuklish was 31 years old, a Czech tourist who had come to the Croatian coast for one of the most demanding recreational activities there is. On the 10th of September, 2002, he was on a cave diving excursion in Poganica Bay, near Split, in Croatia. Cave diving is a specialized form of tourism, one that draws people who want something more than an ordinary dive, the thrill of moving through submerged, enclosed spaces where few people ever go. It is also one of the most hazardous forms of diving in the world. The dangers people usually discuss are all environmental and all terrifying in their own right. Disorientation in the dark, running out of air far from an exit, becoming entangled or trapped in a confined space with no easy way back to the surface. Anyone who takes up cave diving knows they are entering an environment that offers very little forgiveness, where a calm mind and careful training are the only real protection. But what happened to Miroslav did not come from any of those hazards. During the dive, he stabbed himself in the chest with a knife, in an act that was documented not as an accident but as suicide. The confined underwater setting left no room for rescue or intervention. He died at the dive site from self-inflicted chest trauma. Fellow divers and guides would have been faced with the aftermath in one of the least reachable places imaginable, and emergency services responded. But his injuries were fatal. The record of the case is stark. It notes his status as a tourist, the nature of the trip, and the deliberate nature of the act. There is no way to soften what it describes, and it would be wrong to pretend the story is something other than what it is. A man traveled to a beautiful coastline for an adventure, and instead ended his own life beneath the water. If you or someone you know is struggling, please reach out to someone. There are people who will listen, and help is available. The stark twist of this case is one of context. Amid all the standard risks of cave diving, the environmental dangers that fill every safety briefing, the cause of death was none of them. It was intentional, carried out with a piece of equipment meant for survival, a diver's knife carried to cut free from entanglement. The tool meant to keep him alive in an emergency became the instrument of the opposite. Miroslav Kuklish was 31. He is remembered here plainly as a person, and his story is told with the same care as every other in this record. Every July, the narrow streets of Pamplona, in northern Spain, fill with people from all over the world for the San Fermin festival, and its most famous ritual, the running of the bulls. The tradition dates back to 1910, and it has become one of the great bucket list events on the planet. Thousands of thrill seekers, many of them foreign tourists, gather at dawn to run ahead of a group of fighting bulls as the animals are driven through the old town toward the bull ring. The appeal is obvious. It is dangerous, historic, and utterly unlike anything in ordinary life. For many who travel there, running with the bulls is the whole reason for the trip, a story they will tell forever, proof they did something bold. The atmosphere is electric, the crowds enormous, the sense of shared risk part of the thrill. But the bulls are not a spectacle put on for safety. They are powerful animals that can sprint at frightening speed, turn without warning, slip on the cobblestones, and become disoriented and panicked in the crush of bodies and noise. Runners, packed into narrow streets and sometimes affected by the festival's flowing alcohol, can fall, be knocked down, or find themselves cornered with nowhere to go. When that happens, a bull's horns can penetrate the chest, the abdomen, or the limbs in an instant. Since 1910, 16 people have been fatally gored at Pamplona's festival, tourists among them. The victims typically die from catastrophic internal bleeding or organ damage. Festival medics treat the injured on site and rush them to hospital, but a serious goring in a fast-moving crowd leaves very little time. Official festival statistics track these fatalities and the many serious injuries that occur alongside them, and the deaths are classed as accidental, arising from voluntary participation in an event everyone knows to be dangerous. That is the striking thing about Pamplona. The danger is not hidden. It is openly advertised, part of the very appeal. Organizers issue explicit warnings, advising that only fit, sober people in proper footwear should take part, and they lay out strict rules for the run. Nothing about the risk is concealed. And yet, year after year, participants underestimate just how fast and unpredictable the bulls really are. In the excitement of the moment, in the roar of the crowd, a thrill that was chosen freely can become a fatal mistake in seconds. The people who have died in those streets did not stumble into danger unaware. They traveled toward it, drew by the same thrill that draws thousands more safely through every year. The bulls simply do not care about the odds. On the wrong morning, in the wrong stretch of street, a bucket list adventure ends in a way no one running that day imagined for themselves. Daniel Owen was 47, a private school teacher. His son Cooper was 15. They were Americans living in Vietnam, and on the 15th of October, 2025, they were together on an adventure holiday in Laos, at a zip-line site set among the jungle. Picture what that day was meant to be. A father and his teenage son sharing an adventure, the kind of trip that becomes part of a family's story forever. Zip-lining is a classic holiday thrill, the marketing built around the rush of speed and the beauty of gliding high above the trees. They came for that, the harnesses, the cable stretching out over the canopy, the drop beneath their feet. Everything about the experience is designed to make you feel a controlled kind of danger, the sort you can walk away from grinning. The safety briefings are all about falls, about clipping in correctly, about the height. That is the risk everyone prepares for. It was not the risk that found them. During the activity, an unexpected swarm of giant hornets attacked Daniel and Cooper. Giant hornets are among the most dangerous stinging insects in the world, their venom capable of causing severe reactions even in small numbers. This was not a few stings. Father and son were stung over 100 times each, suffering massive envenomation. And the attack most likely came while they were suspended or moving along the line, in exactly the position that made escape impossible. There was nowhere to run, no way to swat the swarm away and get to safety, only the cable and the open air and the insects. They were taken to hospital after the attack, but the sheer scale of the envenomation was more than their bodies could withstand. Both Daniel and Cooper died hours later from the overwhelming number of stings and the complications that followed. A father and his 15-year-old son lost on the same day in the same terrible event. The incident was recorded as an unusual death, noting the context of the adventure holiday, the species involved, the approximate number of stings, and the fatal outcome. Giant hornet stings, at that dose, can trigger anaphylaxis, massive tissue damage, and organ failure. The venom load from more than 100 stings is simply catastrophic. Here is the bitter contradiction at the heart of it. Adventure tourism markets itself on managing risk. Operators check harnesses, inspect cables, drill safety into every guest. All of that attention is aimed at the fall that almost never comes. The real killer that day was Something no harness could stop, and no briefing could foresee. A sudden swarm of insects emerging without warning in a wild place. Wildlife hazards like that are notoriously difficult to predict, and by the time they appeared, Daniel and Cooper were already suspended in the one position that gave them no chance to flee. A father and son went into the jungle to share an adventure. Daniel was 47. Cooper was 15. They died within hours of each other, side by side, on a day that was supposed to be one of the best of their lives. It was the Saturday of a holiday weekend, the 28th of May, 2016, and the Cincinnati Zoo and Botanical Garden was packed. Among the crowd was a 3-year-old boy, there with his mother and his brothers and sisters. He was a small child with a big idea fixed in his head. More than once that day, he told his mother he wanted to go inside the gorilla enclosure. To a 3-year-old, the great dark shapes behind the glass were not a warning. They were the most interesting thing he had ever seen. For a few seconds, while his mother's attention was on the other children, the boy acted on that idea. He climbed over a 3-foot barrier, pushed through a screen of bushes, and dropped. He fell somewhere between 10 and 15 feet, down into the moat inside Gorilla World, the home of a 17-year-old western lowland gorilla named Harambe. Harambe weighed several hundred pounds. He approached the child and stood over him. At times he dragged the boy through the shallow water, and in one violent pull, the child's head struck the concrete. Visitors above were screaming. Phones were filming. The water churned around an animal that could end a small life in a heartbeat, almost without meaning to. Inside the zoo, staff called a Code 1, a dangerous animal loose with a person. The dangerous animal response team gathered fast. They had a terrible choice in front of them. A tranquilizer dart would take minutes to work, and a startled, half-sedated silverback might do anything in those minutes. They decided that lethal force was faster and safer than the alternative. A specialist raised a rifle and fired a single shot. Harambe was dead. The boy was lifted out and rushed to hospital, where he was treated for scrapes and a concussion-type injury. He survived. The video went around the world within hours, and so did the outrage. People argued about the mother, about the team's decision, about whether a magnificent animal had to die. Cincinnati police investigated. The county prosecutor later announced the mother would not face criminal charges. The U.S. Department of Agriculture inspected the exhibit, and the barrier was later raised and reinforced. Zoo director Thane Maynard faced the cameras and stood by his team. "You can't take a risk with a silverback gorilla," he said, calling it a difficult but right decision that saved a little boy's life. Here was the hard irony of it. The barrier met every industry standard. The rules to supervise children and stay behind the railings were clear. And still, a determined 3-year-old defeated a system built for reasonable behavior. In the end, it was the gorilla who died, an animal who had done nothing but be what he was, in the space that was supposed to be his. If you're already thinking how easily a few unwatched seconds could undo anyone, you're not alone. Subscribe and stay with me. On the 28th of August, 2022, a man named Jesse Ray Conyers walked into the Accra Zoo, set inside the Akimota Forest in Ghana's capital. Reports placed him as a middle-aged man, though his exact age varied from account to account. He arrived as an ordinary member of the public. What he did next was anything but ordinary. The lion enclosure at Accra was no casual thing to enter. It had an outer fence and an inner protective fence, the perimeter standing more than 10 feet high. Inside lived an adult male lion, a lioness, and 2 cubs. There was no path for a visitor to reach them, no gap, no oversight. The barriers existed for exactly one reason: to keep human beings and lions apart. Conyers climbed over them. Witnesses and officials said he scaled the high fence and dropped down into the enclosure with the lions. His motive was never firmly established. Some reports suggested he may have intended to take one of the cubs. Whatever was in his mind, the result was the same the moment his feet hit the ground inside. He approached the animals. The lions reacted as lions do when something crosses into their space and comes near their young, defensively, then violently. They attacked. By the time zoo staff understood what was happening and coordinated with security forces, the man had suffered catastrophic injuries. Rangers worked to drive the lions back so they could reach him. It was already too late. Conyers was declared dead at the scene, and his body was taken to a morgue. Ghana's Forestry Commission closed the zoo to the public while the case was investigated. No lions escaped. No animals were harmed. The commission said, its preliminary findings were plain. The victim had trespassed, climbing past the inner fence into the heart of the enclosure. Police opened a criminal investigation, weighing the possibility that he had entered to steal a cub, though that was never formally proven. What the authorities were certain of was that the security features had been intact and that the man had to deliberately climb over them to get inside. John Alate, the Forestry Commission's chief executive, did not mince words afterward. The lion, he said, is an animal you should never get close to. Never, under any circumstances, in its enclosure. On the death itself, he was blunt. The intruder was attacked and injured by one of the lions, and he died from his injuries. The irony sat in that single word, intruder. Everything about the design of the place said stay out. 2 fences, 10 feet of them, and the simple, ancient truth that a lion protecting its cubs is not a thing a person can talk down or outrun. He crossed into a space that had never been his, and the lions, doing only what was natural inside their own home, ended his life within reach of the barriers built to save it. The 29th of January, 2017, fell during the Lunar New Year holiday, the busiest travel season in China. A man named Ji Se, in his 40s and originally from Hubei but working in the coastal city of Ningbo, had come to the Yunggor Zoo with his wife, his children, and some friends. It was meant to be a family day out during the holiday. At the main gate, the group balked at the ticket price. The fee was modest, but the decision they made to avoid it would be anything but. Rather than pay, they looked for another way in. G and at least one other set out to climb the zoo's perimeter wall and slip onto the grounds without buying admission. The wall G chose to climb was about 3 meters high. Warning signs marked the area. He went over anyway, and on the far side he did not find a quiet patch of zoo lawn. He had crossed into the inner safety perimeter around the tiger exhibit. He pushed on through trees and brush, separated now from his family, who had stayed outside, until he was inside the tiger enclosure itself. A Siberian tiger found him. The animal attacked, dragging and mauling him while onlookers screamed from beyond the fence and filmed what they could not stop. Zoo staff rushed to respond, trying first to drive the tiger off with firecrackers and water. When that failed, they shot and killed the tiger. G was pulled out alive but terribly injured and taken to hospital. He died there later the same day, from massive trauma. The footage spread across Chinese social media within hours, and with it came a furious national argument about personal responsibility and the duty of zoos to protect even those who break the rules. The tiger was dead. The other tigers were kept inside. Local authorities confirmed what had happened in clear terms. G had entered by climbing the wall in an unauthorized area, instead of using the main gate. The zoo stated that warning signs about dangerous animals and no entry zones had been in place. Officials concluded the direct cause of his death was his own choice to trespass into a restricted, plainly dangerous area in order to avoid paying. One official summed it up grimly. He had ignored the warning signs and climbed over the fence, and the tiger then pounced on him. The irony was the one that haunted the coverage for weeks. A man tried to save the cost of a single zoo ticket. The decision cost him his life, cost a protected Siberian tiger its life, and left his wife and children standing on the other side of a fence, watching, unable to do anything but scream his name. On the morning of the 6th of July, 1,999 staff at SeaWorld Orlando arrived to a site none of them could have prepared for. In the killer whale tank, draped over the back of a large male orca named Tilikum, was the body of a man. He was 27 years old. His name was Daniel P. Dukes, and he was a Florida resident with no clear plan and nowhere in particular to be. Dukes had come to the park the day before, on the 5th of July, as an ordinary day guest. He had watched a shamu show. But when the park closed and staff cleared the grounds for the night, Dukes did not leave. Somehow he evaded security and stayed behind, alone in the dark with the animals after everyone else had gone home. At some point overnight, he scaled the barriers around the orca tank, barriers designed to keep guests out, with staff-only access and warning signage. He entered the water with Tilikum, a multi-ton apex predator. There were no witnesses. What happened next had to be pieced together afterward from the marks left behind. When staff found him in the morning, his body bore multiple injuries, lacerations and bruising consistent with the whale's force. The Orange County medical examiner ruled the death an accident, with drowning as the primary cause alongside the traumatic injuries. The autopsy report noted that those injuries were consistent with being held underwater by the mammal. Investigators could not say for certain whether he had willingly climbed in to swim with the whale or fallen after reaching into the tank. Toxicology reportedly found no significant drugs or alcohol in his system. The case drew international attention, in part because of who the whale was. Investigators confirmed that the park's security and physical barriers were built to keep guests away from the tank after hours, and that Dukes had bypassed all of them to get in. His family later sued SeaWorld, alleging the security and warnings had been inadequate. SeaWorld denied liability. The irony deepened with time. Tilikum would be linked to the death of trainer Dawn Brandshaw in 2010, years later, in a case that became world famous. But Dukes' death had already delivered the same lesson, quietly and without an audience. A man alone in the dark had treated a captive orca as something that could be approached, even embraced, like a tame thing. The whale was an enormous wild predator, and the water was its world, not his. By the time the sun came up, that distinction was the only thing the evidence had left to say. Carlos Eduardo Souza Jr. was 22 years old, and, of all people, the son of a zookeeper. On the 8th of March, 2010, he was at the Brasilia Zoo in Brazil's capital, near the jaguar enclosure. He wanted, by the accounts that survive, to get closer to the cats, close enough to touch one, in an area that was never meant for visitors. There is a particular sadness in that detail. Souza Jr. had grown up around the rules of a zoo. He would have known better than almost anyone in that crowd why the fences stood where they did, why the signs told visitors to keep their distance from the bars, especially for the big cats. The knowledge was in his blood, passed down by a father whose job was to manage these very dangers. He ignored it. Reports say he bypassed the public barriers and entered a restricted corridor beside the jaguar habitat, climbing a fence to reach a position no guest should ever occupy. From there, he came close enough that one or more of the jaguars could reach him. They could, and they did. The animals seized him and pulled, inflicting severe bites and claw wounds. Zoo staff and emergency services rushed to free him from the cats. He was taken to hospital with extensive injuries and major blood loss, and he died a short time later. Brazilian media reported the case as a tragic example of someone setting aside zoo rules to get near a dangerous animal, and the coverage kept returning to that one painful fact about who he was. Authorities determined Souza Jr. had entered an area restricted to staff, where multiple warning signs and barriers had been in place. Zoo officials stressed that the proper distances and fences had always separated the public from the predator enclosures, and that the victim had crossed every one of those safeguards. The jaguars were not put down. The incident was treated for what it was, a human being who had walked into a dangerous animal's space. A spokesperson put it plainly, in words that translate to this: he ignored the warnings and went into an area forbidden to the public, where the animal could reach him. The cruel symmetry of it stayed with the people who reported it. The one person in that zoo who had been taught the rules from childhood was the one who chose to step past them. The fences he had grown up beside could not save a young man who had decided, just this once, that they did not apply to him. On the 23rd of September, 2014, a 20-year-old man was visiting the National Zoological Park in New Delhi with friends. He has been reported under several names, Maqsood among them, and he had come from Uttar Pradesh to see the animals. The white tiger enclosure drew him in. A male white tiger named Vijay lived there, an animal weighing around 400 kilograms, behind a dry moat and a low barricade. What he did next, witnesses said, he did against repeated warnings. The young man climbed over a low fence and sat down on a 3-foot barricade overlooking the moat. From up there he had a clear view of the tiger below. Other visitors told him to get down. Guards told him to get down. He stayed where he was, perched on the edge above a creature that could kill in seconds. Then he lost his balance. He fell roughly 18 to 20 feet, down into the dry moat inside Vijay's enclosure. And for a long, agonizing stretch, perhaps 10 to 15 minutes, nothing happened. The tiger stood near him. The young man cowered and pleaded. Above, the crowd grew frantic. People shouted. Some threw objects at the animal, trying, in their panic, to help. It may have done the opposite. Eventually the tiger lunged, took the young man by the neck, and mauled him while horrified visitors filmed it all. The zoo staff had no rifles and no fast-acting tranquilizers immediately on hand. Their attempts to scare the tiger back into its den failed. By the time forestry officials and emergency responders reached the enclosure, the young man was dead from severe neck and head injuries. The footage flooded Indian media and brought public fury down on the zoo's safety and its emergency protocols. The zoo director said the enclosure met Central Zoo Authority guidelines, but acknowledged that the barrier had been low enough to climb easily. Eyewitnesses repeated that the guards had warned the young man again and again to move away before he ever fell. Reviews afterward called for higher fences, clearer signs, and better emergency tools for the big cat enclosures. The most disturbing detail was the standoff itself. For several minutes, the tiger did not attack. One witness recalled the desperate shouting in the crowd, people pleading with others not to throw stones at the tiger, saying it was being provoked. A tense, fragile pause, with a frightened man on one side and a confused animal on the other, may have been broken by the very crowd that wanted to save him. The signs had said, "Do not cross." The guards had said, "Get down." The gap between heeding them and ignoring them was about 3 feet of railing. This next story comes to us from further back and through thinner records, but it carries the same warning. In the early 1990s, reported as 1992, a man of about 32 went into the municipal zoo in Bydgoszcz, Poland. According to Polish reporting later summarized in English, he climbed over the public barrier and into the zoo's bear enclosure. The accounts that survive describe a man who entered to show off, to taunt or get close to the bears, perhaps under the influence of alcohol. The bear pit was clearly fenced off from the public, with warning signs marking it as forbidden. None of that stopped him. He went over the barrier and dropped into the pit where the bears lived. Once inside, he approached one or more of the animals. Bears are not the lumbering, comic creatures of cartoons. They are powerful predators, with no patience for an intruder in their space. They attacked, mauling him severely. Bystanders raised the alarm and called for zoo staff and emergency services. It was not enough. The man died of his injuries, either at the scene or shortly after reaching hospital, according to the press reports of the time. Local authorities concluded that he had trespassed into a restricted enclosure, one that had been clearly fenced off from the public. The reports describe alcohol and deliberate risk-taking as factors, though precise details are scarce in the English-language record. Later summaries paraphrase local police, saying he had climbed into the enclosure despite warnings and was attacked almost immediately. What remains is a story repeated so often in these cases that it has nearly become a form. A man, possibly emboldened by drink, possibly wanting to impress someone watching, decided that the bears behind the fence were tame enough, slow enough, safe enough to approach. The captivity had changed nothing about what the animals were. The barrier and the signs had been put there by people who understood that. Within moments of crossing them, so did he, too late to matter. The strongest stories often close a video, and this last one is among the hardest to sit with. On the 21st of May, 2016, a 20-year-old Chilean man named Franco Luis Ferrada Romero visited the Santiago Metropolitan Zoo. He came in as a regular guest, but tucked in his clothing, found later, was a note that suggested he was in the grip of a mental health crisis, that he believed he was undergoing some kind of apocalyptic test. Whatever was happening in his mind, what he did next was witnessed by visitors who could not look away. Romero climbed over the public barrier into the lions exhibit. He removed his clothes, and then he walked toward two adult African lions. The lions noticed his clothing first, playing with the fabric as a curiosity. Then their attention shifted to the man himself. They attacked, inflicting severe injuries as zoo staff scrambled to clear the area of visitors. With Romero already gravely hurt, the zoo's emergency protocol, the one that placed human life first, authorized lethal force. Keepers shot and killed both lions in a desperate effort to reach him. It was not enough to save him. Romero was rushed to a nearby hospital in critical condition, with severe head and pelvic injuries, and he later died. The note in his clothing referenced the end of the world and suggested he had meant to die there. Some outlets reported that authorities treated it as a suicide attempt. The incident set off a national debate about zoo safety, about mental health, and about whether the keepers had ever had any real alternative to shooting the lions. Animal rights groups condemned the killing and called for better barriers and emergency planning. Chilean prosecutors opened an inquiry. Their early findings confirmed that Romero had deliberately entered a clearly restricted enclosure, bypassing the barriers. Zoo officials said their staff had followed established protocols designed to protect human life above all else, and yet the outcome left no one to protect. The director spoke for a heartbroken staff. "We are all affected. We love these animals. They are like our children." The starkest irony, noted everywhere the story was told, was the arithmetic of it. Two lions, acting only on instinct within their own enclosure, were shot dead. The man they had attacked died anyway. No one was saved. Two animals were lost, and a young man in crisis was gone, and all of it set in motion by a single conviction that he could, or should, be inside that exhibit. The barriers had been clear, the signs in place. They were never built to hold back a person who had already decided to cross them. In April 1992, a young man stood at the head of the Stampede Trail near Healy, Alaska, with a .22 rifle, a small bag of rice, and a stack of books. His name was Christopher McCandless. He was 24, a graduate of Emory University, and for 2 years he had been traveling under the name Alexander Supertramp. After college, he gave away most of his savings and roamed the American West, looking for a life stripped down to its simplest form, lived close to nature, and answerable to no one. Alaska was meant to be the heart of it. He planned to live off the land alone for several months, hunting, foraging, reading, and writing in his journal. On the 28th of April, a local man drove him to the trailhead and let him out. McCandless hiked in with minimal gear and soon found an abandoned Fairbanks City Transit bus, number 142, which road workers had once used for shelter. He moved in and made it his base. For a while it worked. His journal and photographs show early success with small game and the slow rhythm of a man living his idea of freedom. Before he left, he had written that the simple beauty of it all was too good to pass up. But the same photographs show something else over the weeks, his body growing thinner. By July, the snowmelt had swollen the nearby Teklenica River into a deep, fast torrent. The shallow stream he had stepped across in spring was now a barrier he could not safely recross. The way back to the road was closed. His condition fell away sharply after that. At some point, he scrawled a note and left it on the bus door, asking anyone who came by for help, saying he was too weak to walk out. On the 6th of September, 1992, moose hunters found his decomposed body inside a sleeping bag in the bus. An autopsy recorded his weight at around 30 kilograms, about 67 pounds, and gave the cause of death as starvation. His story spread across the country, told first in a magazine article and then in John Krakauer's book, Into the Wild, and a later film. Krakauer suggested McCandless may also have been weakened by toxic wild potato seeds, though that remains debated and is not settled in the scientific literature. The medical examiner's conclusion stayed simple: he starved. Park and state officials kept returning to the same factors. He had little experience of the Alaskan backcountry, inadequate gear, and no detailed maps. And here is the hardest part. A proper topographic map would have shown a hand-operated cable tram crossing the Teklenica only a short distance downstream, away across the river that had trapped him. He apparently never knew it was there. The bus itself became a place of pilgrimage, and so many visitors needed rescuing that in 2020, the Alaska National Guard airlifted it out for public safety. He went looking for freedom in a wild place, and the gap between the dream and the ground beneath it cost him everything. If you're already thinking how easily a single missing detail can turn a plan deadly, you're not alone. So subscribe and stay with me. On the 15th of April, 2008, a group of young people walked into the Mangatepopo Gorge near Tongariro National Park on New Zealand's North Island. Most of them were students and teachers from Elim Christian College in Auckland, there for an organized outdoor education trip. The activity was canyoning, run by the Sir Edmund Hillary Outdoor Pursuits Center, a respected institution that offered adventure challenges to students and visitors. Among the group that day was a visiting British tourist, a 47-year-old London nurse named Moira Everett, on a long-anticipated holiday in New Zealand's national parks with her husband Bobby. Canyoning here meant walking, wading, and abseiling down a narrow volcanic gorge, a slot of rock with steep, near-vertical walls. It was promoted as a character-building outdoor challenge. That afternoon, 11 students, a teacher, and 2 instructors entered the gorge. Weather forecasts had warned of heavy rain. The rain began, and water started to rise. A narrow slot like Mangatepo does not let rising water spread out. It funnels everything into one channel. The stream that the group was wading through turned into a powerful flash flood, and a wall of water surged down the gorge. It swept participants off their feet and carried them over one waterfall and chute after another. 7 students and a teacher from Elim Christian College were drowned. So was Moira Everett. Her husband Bobby, who had stayed out of the gorge, survived to learn she had not. A large rescue operation recovered the victims downstream. The loss of so many schoolchildren stunned New Zealand and brought national mourning, and memorial services were held both there and in the United Kingdom for Moira. Then came the questions. A Department of Labor investigation and a coroner's inquest found serious failings by the Outdoor Pursuits Center. The center had no effective flood risk management plan for that gorge. It failed to adequately monitor weather and river conditions, and it let the trip go ahead despite warnings of heavy rain. In 2010, the center pleaded guilty to health and safety charges and was fined. The court found that the deaths had been preventable, had proper risk assessment and decision-making been in place. The irony sits in the forecast itself. Official warnings of significant rain and possible river rises were available before the group ever set foot in the gorge. At sentencing, the judge described how those young people and their teacher had been placed in an environment that turned, very quickly, from challenging to deadly. A trip designed to teach resilience instead became one of the worst outdoor education tragedies in the country's history, and it turned on a decision that the weather had already argued against. On the 12th of May, 1986, a group of 20 people set out to climb Mount Hood in Oregon. 15 were students from Oregon Episcopal School in Portland, the others adults, including a climbing instructor. The climb was part of the school's annual base camp program, a mountaineering and outdoor education expedition meant to build resilience and leadership in young people. They started up the south side of the mountain by the standard route, the kind of climb sometimes thought of as a beginner's glacier ascent near a ski resort. The weather turned on them sharply. Winds rose, snow began, and the slopes closed into whiteout. Somewhere near 10,500 feet above Timberline Lodge, the party lost its bearings. Faced with the storm, they made a decision that would define everything that followed. Instead of descending quickly while they still could, they dug a snow cave to wait it out. But the cave was too small for the whole group, and it offered little protection from the extreme cold and thin air at that altitude. They spent roughly 2 nights packed into that inadequate shelter as the temperature bled the warmth out of them. After a time, several members left to try to find help, and a large search and rescue operation began. It took more than 3 days to locate the party. By then, the cave had collapsed, and some of the students inside had already died of hypothermia. Others died shortly after being found. In total, 9 people lost their lives, 7 of them students. It became one of the deadliest mountaineering incidents in American history. The survivors did not come away whole. Many suffered severe frostbite, and some required amputations. Families and the wider community gathered for joint memorial services for children who had set out on a school trip. When the incident was reviewed, the same threads appeared again and again. The group had underestimated a forecast storm. Weather was not adequately monitored as they climbed, and rather than turning back early, they pushed upward into worsening conditions until retreat became impossible. The school's outdoor program drew heavy criticism, and Oregon Episcopal School later overhauled and scaled back its mountaineering. The tragedy prompted reforms across the country in how schools oversee high-risk outdoor activities for minors. Rescuers spoke afterward about the false comfort of a mountain that looks friendly. Mount Hood sits near a ski resort and draws beginners, but in bad weather it becomes a brutally dangerous place. As one put it, "The mountain is not a playground, and it does not care that you are a child on a school trip." A program built to forge character in young people became, through a chain of small misjudgments and one violent storm, a place where 9 of them did not come home. On the 19th of February, 2012, 16 skiers and snowboarders gathered to ski Tunnel Creek, a backcountry area just outside the Stevens Pass Resort in Washington state. This was no casual group. It was full of professionals and industry insiders, people who lived and breathed snow. Among them were Jim Jack, a 46-year-old free-skiing judge, Chris Rudolph, the 30-year-old marketing director at Stevens Pass, and John Brennan, a 41-year-old skier. They came for Tunnel Creek's famous steep tree-lined chutes and a day of fresh, untracked powder. That morning, the Northwest Avalanche Center had rated the danger as considerable, level 3 of 5. The bulletin warned that large, dangerous avalanches were possible, especially on steep, north-facing slopes. That description fit Tunnel Creek almost exactly. The group accessed the terrain by a resort lift and a short hike, then began their descent, staggering their starts but still moving across overlapping ground on the same mountainside. As part of the group crossed a steep, north-facing slope, a large slab of snow released above them. A wall of it swept several skiers down through the trees, burying some under meters of debris. The survivors did everything they had been trained to do. They used their transceivers, they dug with their shovels, they raced the clock, but they could not reach everyone in time. Jim Jack, Chris Rudolph, and John Brennan were found without vital signs. The story became the subject of a major New York Times multimedia investigation called Snowfall, which reconstructed the avalanche minute by minute using interviews, GPS data, and snow science, and went on to win a Pulitzer Prize. It shook the North American ski community, in part because of who had died, and in part because of how it had happened. Investigators concluded the slope was inherently unstable, with a weak layer buried under newer snow, exactly the hazard the bulletin had described that morning. No single person was blamed. Instead, analysts framed it as a system accident, the product of terrain, snowpack, and human behavior all at once. They pointed to group psychology, to the social pull of skiing a legendary line with a large crowd, and to how dissent about the conditions stayed quiet when so many experts were present. That is the unbearable part. The warning that morning practically named the very slope they skied, and the people standing on it were among the most avalanche-aware in the region. One survivor, Elise Sogstad, later told the Times that they were the best of the best, and it still got them. Their skill was real. It just was not enough, on that slope, on that day, against snow that did not care how good they were. The next one is harder to sit with precisely because nothing about it is dramatic. There was no storm, no avalanche, no fall. There was only the temperature, dropping in the dark. He was an adult man, an experienced day hiker but not an expert in winter mountaineering, and he set out alone on a cold season overnight trip into a mountain backcountry. The plan was a challenge he could be proud of. Hike up, camp near a ridge, and spend a winter-like night out in the wild. It is the kind of goal that sounds modest and reasonable, the sort of trip thousands of people complete safely. He carried limited cold weather gear, and he underestimated how cold the night would really get, and how hard the wind would blow. Once the sun went down, the conditions deteriorated. The temperature fell, and the wind chill climbed. At some point he became disoriented and exhausted, possibly after leaving the trail to look for a sheltered spot to make camp. Off the path, in the dark and the cold, with the wrong equipment, his margin quietly disappeared. He was later found lying on the ground, unresponsive. There were no external injuries and no signs of a struggle. The medical examiner's report concluded he had died of hypothermia. His core temperature had dropped to the point where his heart slowed and then stopped. The environment alone had been enough. What stayed with the rescuers was how close he had been. He had succumbed within a relatively short distance of a shelter or trailhead, near the safety he had been trying to reach. The investigation found no trauma and no foul play. The likely contributing factors were simple and familiar. Clothing that was inadequate for the temperature, no proper sleeping system for the cold, and probably fatigue on top of it all. The death became a local cautionary example, the kind that mountain rescue organizations point to when they remind people that hypothermia does not need extreme conditions to kill. It can take hold in near-freezing temperatures when someone is wet, wind-exposed, or simply not moving. Being almost there offers no protection if you cannot keep yourself warm enough to finish the walk. He did not die from anything you would put in an adventure story. He died from cold, on an ordinary night, within sight of the very safety he was heading toward. In Grand Canyon National Park in Arizona, a woman set out on a recreational day hike along a rim-side trail, the kind lined with scenic overlooks where the ground falls away into the canyon. The details that survive are sparse, and the account comes largely through secondary reporting rather than named news coverage, so some of it is told as reported rather than confirmed. What is clear is the shape of what happened, and it is the kind of thing the park warns about constantly. She was traversing a section of trail near a steep drop when a thunderstorm built in the area. Then, lightning struck the ground nearby. The medical report later noted evidence of electrical exposure on her body consistent with a close strike rather than a direct hit. Investigators concluded she had not been struck directly, but had been caught by ground current or a side flash, the electricity spreading out from where it hit the earth. It was enough to disrupt her neuromuscular control for a moment. That moment came at the worst possible place. The electrical shock caused brief disorientation and a delayed motor response, and in that instant of impairment, she lost her balance on the uneven terrain at the canyon's edge. She fell a considerable distance. The injuries from the fall were massive, and she was found unresponsive below. Park rangers and emergency medical crews responded and attempted to revive her, but they could not. The medical examiner recorded the primary cause of death as blunt force trauma from the fall, with the lightning-related electrical exposure listed as a contributing factor. There was no evidence of foul play and no pre-existing condition. The chain of events was attributed entirely to weather and topography, to a storm and a cliff arriving at the same place at the same time. The Grand Canyon is one of the most lightning-aware parks in the country. Visitors are routinely warned to seek shelter when thunderstorms approach and to get away from exposed rims and overlooks, especially during monsoon season. Signs and brochures highlight the risk. The standard messaging is blunt. If you can hear thunder, you are close enough to be struck. And that is the cruel turn in this one. The lightning did not kill her where she stood. It only stunned her, just enough, just long enough, that she lost her footing. The very feature she had hiked out to see, the open edge with the view, became the thing that finished what the strike had started. A storm she could probably hear coming reached her at the one spot where a single unsteady step had nowhere to go but down. Some climbers spend a lifetime chasing the limits of what a human body can do on a mountain. Ueli Steck did it faster than almost anyone alive. The 40-year-old Swiss alpinist was known as the Swiss Machine, a man who set speed records on the Eiger's North Face and other great alpine walls, climbing routes in a fraction of the time others needed. In the spring of 2017, he was in the Everest region of Nepal with an audacious goal. He intended to traverse from Everest to Lhotse by way of the rarely repeated Hornbein Couloir, solo, and without supplemental oxygen. It was the kind of objective that defined him: bold, minimal, stripped of anything that might slow him down. Before any of that, though, he needed to acclimatize, to let his body adjust to the altitude. That was supposed to be the safe part. On the 30th of April, 2017, Steck set out alone from around Camp 2, climbing toward Nuptse on an acclimatization push. Other climbers saw him heading up early that morning in good weather. He was roped only to himself, with no partner and no belayer below him. Then he did not return, and a search began. Sherpa rescuers spotted his body far below, on the Nuptse face, at an altitude of roughly 6,600 to 6,800 meters. He had fallen a long way down steep, icy ground. He was pronounced dead at the scene, and his body was later brought down to base camp. The news stunned the climbing world, and tributes described him as one of the greatest alpinists of his generation. The planned Everest-Lhotse traverse was abandoned. There was no formal accident inquiry beyond standard mountaineering reporting, and no one saw the fall itself. Most accounts conclude that he likely slipped or lost his balance on hard ice or mixed terrain, with nothing and no one to catch him. It reinforced a hard truth about high-altitude climbing. Even the most elite can be killed by a single mistake, and even what looks like a routine outing offers no immunity. The irony cut deep through the community that knew his work. Steck had survived countless cutting-edge climbs, the kind that should have killed an ordinary climber many times over, and he died not on his headline objective, but on the preparation for it. His style, fast and light and almost free of equipment, was seen by admirers as pure alpinism and by critics as a way of climbing that left no margin for error. He had said it plainly himself once, that if you want to climb big mountains fast and light, you must accept that the margin is very small. On a clear morning, on terrain well within his ability, that margin closed. George Allen Smith IV was 26 years old, an American on the honeymoon he and his new wife had planned for a long time. The couple had married only days before boarding Royal Caribbean's Brilliance of the Seas for a 12-day Mediterranean itinerary. This was the trip that was supposed to open their married life, a slow drift past ancient coastlines with nothing to do but be together. Jennifer Hagel Smith would later describe it plainly on a victims advocacy website. On July 5, 2005, her husband tragically went overboard during their honeymoon cruise. But behind that flat sentence sits one of the most stubborn, unsolved cases in modern cruising. On the night of July 4th, George and Jennifer dined together, then moved through the ship's casino and bars, reportedly drinking heavily. As the night wore on, the couple split apart in the crowd. George ended up socializing in a cabin with several young male passengers, some of whom would later be investigated in connection with his death. Jennifer, badly intoxicated, was eventually found passed out in a ship corridor at roughly the same time her husband disappeared. The sea was off the Turkish coast, dark and calm, the ship a lit box moving through it. Around 4:30 in the morning, passengers and crew heard a loud thud. Later, blood was found on a metal canopy above the lifeboats, some 20 to 30 feet below the Smiths' stateroom balcony. When George could not be located, more evidence surfaced. Bloodstains were documented inside the couple's cabin. Photographs taken by Royal Caribbean showed blood on the bedsheets. And on the ship's railing, according to reports, was a bloody handprint of 4 fingers, as if a man had gripped it hard before going over. Despite the search, George's body was never recovered. Jennifer, still unconscious, was discovered in the hallway that morning and later disembarked. Cruise officials initially characterized the incident as an accidental fall, an intoxicated passenger who may have sat on the balcony rail and slipped. His family did not accept it. They became convinced almost at once that this was foul play, not misadventure. Investigators from Turkish authorities, the FBI, and other agencies took up the case, but it stayed unresolved and no one was ever charged. The blood and the handprint fed competing theories: that George had been beaten and thrown overboard, or that a robbery in the cabin had escalated into violence. A Dateline investigation gave weight to the robbery gone bad idea, citing witness statements and the physical evidence in the cabin. Years later, in 2013, CNN reported that the FBI's New York office was re-reviewing the case, responding to a family that had never stopped asking. Jennifer filed a wrongful death suit against Royal Caribbean, and the company ultimately reached a confidential settlement with her. What remains is the irony at the center of it. A voyage bought to celebrate a marriage became a decades-long argument about what a handprint means, and how easily alcohol, thin security, and mishandled evidence can leave a family with nothing to hold on to but questions. If you're already thinking how quickly a perfect night can turn into something no one can explain, you're not alone. Subscribe and stay with me. Karen Waltz Roston was 26, a new bride sailing the final day of a 7-day honeymoon cruise to Mexico. She and her husband, Dr. Scott Robin Roston, a 36-year-old chiropractor, had married on the February 4th, 1988, and had booked the trip aboard Sundance Cruises Stardancer as a romantic getaway. On the last day, near Cozumel, they joined a scuba diving excursion together, the kind of thing a honeymoon brochure sells as adventure, the two of them descending into warm, clear water. Karen did not come back up alive. She was found dead in the water, and Scott had a ready account. Powerful currents, he told investigators, had torn away her mask and regulator, and she had drowned before he could reach her. He said he tried to save her, but could not fight the pull of the sea. Told that way, it was a tragedy, the ocean taking a young woman on the happiest trip of her life. Her body was recovered, and at first the death was framed exactly as Scott described it, a diving accident on a honeymoon. Then the examination began to contradict the story. Authorities noted bruising and signs consistent with strangulation, injuries that did not fit a mask ripped off by a current. The forensic conclusion was blunt. Karen had been strangled before she was placed in the water. The current had not killed her. Someone's hands had. Scott Roston was charged with murder. Because the crime occurred on a foreign cruise ship and involved United States citizens, the case fell under U.S. federal jurisdiction. Prosecutors argued that he had killed his wife and then staged the scene to look like a scuba death, leaning on the very risks that every diver is warned about in safety briefings and excursion waivers. The inherent danger of the sport was meant to be his cover. Instead, the physical evidence became the case against him. He was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to prison. The detail that lingers is how deliberately the ocean was cast as the culprit. A dive marketed as a shared romantic experience was chosen precisely because drowning at sea looks like the sort of thing that just happens. One summary of the case put it starkly. Karen's husband strangled her to death before throwing her overboard to make it look like she had an accident. The equipment failure he described was the one explanation nobody on a honeymoon would think to doubt, and for a short while, nobody did. Karen Roston was 26 years old, 1 week into a marriage, when she went down on that last dive. The case is now used as a textbook example of a homicide disguised as a recreational mishap at sea, a warning about how the language of accident can be borrowed to hide something chosen. Some of these stories are old, and the record thins the further back you go, but the shape of them survives. In 1959, a newlywed named Lynn Kaufman sailed aboard the SS Utrecht with her husband. Her exact age is not clearly documented in the accounts that remain, and even her husband's name is reported inconsistently. What the summaries do preserve is that she traveled as a young bride, and that during the voyage she reportedly had a cabin maid assigned to her, a small marker of a trip meant to feel comfortable and cared for. The voyage was the kind of thing that suggested safety by its very trappings. Assigned staff, a cabin, a route with a harbor at the end of it. For a couple early in a marriage, the ship was a controlled little world, and Lynn moved through it like any other passenger enjoying the sea. Then, at some point during or immediately after the cruise, she was found overboard and drowned in the harbor. The water that should have been the calm end of the journey became the place her body was recovered. On its own, a drowning in a harbor might read as a terrible accident, a slip, a fall in the dark near the water's edge. But the examination told a harder story. According to later accounts, evidence indicated that Lynn had been beaten before she drowned. That single finding transformed the death from misfortune into something the authorities had to treat as suspicious. Physical trauma before the water meant that whatever happened to her had begun before she ever went in. Her husband was investigated and ultimately tried in relation to her death. As one historical summary of the case records it, it was determined that Lynn Kaufman had been beaten before she drowned in the harbor. Her body was found overboard, but nobody was ever convicted of her murder. The court, in the end, found the husband not guilty. No one else was ever held responsible. The signs of violence were there, documented, acknowledged, and yet they could not be pinned to a person, to the standard a court requires. That is the quiet cruelty of the Kaufman case. Even with an assigned maid, even inside the comfortable illusion of a well-run ship, a young bride's apparent fall overboard concealed what looked like an assault that the law could not resolve. The evidence spoke, but not clearly enough to name anyone, and Lynn's death slid into the long list of maritime cases that end without an answer. More than 60 years on, she is a name in a compilation, and little more, a woman who boarded a ship in 1959 and was found in the harbor with bruises that no verdict ever fully explained. The record is thin because the era was thin on the tools we now take for granted, and that thinness is itself part of the tragedy. Push back another 3 decades and the documentation grows thinner still, but one case survives in the compilations for a reason. In 1929, a 37-year-old woman remembered only as Ruby sailed aboard the SS Mongolia with her husband. Her surname is not consistently recorded in the accounts that remain, and the specifics of the voyage have largely been lost, but she is described as traveling with her husband on what later retellings characterize as a marital voyage, the ocean liner era's version of a romantic escape across the water. For a married couple in 1929, an ocean liner was about as genteel and safe as travel came. Crisp linens, formal dining, days of nothing but sea air. It was the sort of trip that carried an assumption of respectability, a floating hotel where nothing untoward was supposed to reach you. During that voyage, Ruby became acutely ill and died on board. At first, aboard a ship in 1929, a sudden illness at sea might raise little more than sympathy. People fell ill and died far from home more often then, and the sea offered no hospital. But something about her death did not sit right, and an investigation followed. That investigation reached a disturbing conclusion. Ruby had not died of natural causes. She had been poisoned. The finding turned a private tragedy into a suspected homicide, and the marital context of the trip sharpened the suspicion. Her husband came under scrutiny, as summaries of the case make clear, yet the era's limits closed in fast. Authorities concluded that poisoning, likely deliberate, had caused her death, but the specific poison and the person responsible were never definitively established. No one was ever convicted. As one summary of the SS Mongolia case puts it, she died on board, and it was later found out that she had been poisoned. Nobody was ever convicted of her death, although it is assumed to have been the result of foul play. That is the whole weight of it. Poison is a quiet method. It leaves no handprint on a railing, no bruise for a coroner to photograph. Only a woman who was well and then was not. Nearly a century ago, investigating a homicide at sea meant working with the barest tools, and Ruby's case shows how far short they could fall. A supposedly safe liner voyage for a married couple ended in a killing that everyone suspected and no one could prove. And Ruby remains a first name attached to a poisoning that the record never resolved. Not every danger on a cruise stays on the water. Some of it waits at the ports in the moment a passenger steps off the ship and out of its controlled little world. That is the heart of the case, remembered only as Adriana. Her surname is not consistently documented, and the year is not clearly fixed in the summaries that survive, but the outline of what happened to her is grimly specific. She was on a cruise holiday, described in a romantic context, and at a port of call she left the ship with a man she had met on board. The ship, for all the stories in this episode, is at least a monitored space, with crew and other passengers and some measure of oversight. The port is not. When Adriana disembarked with that male passenger, she stepped out of the ship's jurisdiction and into a place where none of those small protections applied. It was, on its face, the ordinary thing a passenger does at a stop, a few hours ashore with company. She did not come back. Adriana went missing, and the search for her stretched on. 9 days later, her body was found in a shallow grave on land. Investigators determined she had been stabbed to death. The discovery of the grave turned the search into a homicide investigation, and attention fell on the man she had left the ship with. He was arrested and later convicted. As one summary of the case records it, her body was found 9 days later in a shallow grave. The man who was found guilty was convicted of manslaughter and illegal firearm possession, and he had stabbed Adriana to death. The charge was manslaughter rather than murder, but the court's finding acknowledged that he was responsible for her killing. The irony here is one that follows cruise travel everywhere. passengers tend to treat a casual port visit, especially one made with a fellow passenger, as an extension of the safe holiday they paid for. Adriana's case cuts against that assumption. The controlled environment ended at the gangway. Beyond it, a woman who trusted a new acquaintance enough to spend a day ashore with him ended in a shallow grave, and the trust she extended was the thing that cost her. Her case is preserved mainly in a single secondary summary, the dates uncertain, the details sparse, but the core is documented. A cruise passenger, a man she met on board, a walk off the ship, and 9 days later, a grave. It stands as a warning about the vulnerability of passengers, and especially of young women traveling with partners or near strangers, the instant they leave the ship behind. There is a strange afterlife that some of these cases have. When a true story gets retold enough times, in enough places, the names begin to fall away, and what is left is a shape. The Star Dancer honeymoon killing has that afterlife. In some secondary summaries, the bride is not named at all. The husband is described only as a chiropractor, and the case appears as a kind of folk tale of a honeymoon gone wrong. But the underlying facts are the same ones we have already met. This is the Karen Roston case, retold with the identifying details worn off. These derivative accounts keep the setting intact. Newlyweds on a 7-day honeymoon cruise to Mexico aboard the Star Dancer in 1988, the trip marketed as a romantic getaway, the sea warm and inviting. The version told without names carries the same romantic packaging, which is precisely what makes it circulate. A honeymoon, a dive, a young wife lost to the water. It reads like a cautionary story rather than a specific woman's death. The sequence in these retellings mirrors the documented case exactly. On the last day of the honeymoon cruise, the bride went missing during a scuba diving trip. The husband claimed strong currents had ripped away her equipment, and she had drowned. As one summary paraphrases it, the newlyweds were on the last day of their honeymoon cruise when she died during a scuba diving trip, and it was later determined she had been strangled before being thrown into the water. Then comes the turn that these versions preserve even when they drop her name. Investigators found bruising inconsistent with an accidental drowning. They suspected the husband had killed his wife and staged the scene. The retellings confirm foul play rather than accident, and confirm that the husband was charged and convicted, matching the record of Scott Roston's conviction for second-degree murder. There is a value in noticing how this happens. Researchers who mapped the television series Cruise Ship Killers back to real events have been explicit about the process. As one such source puts it, the stories told in the series are based on real cruise ship murders. Although names, details, and locations have been changed, each episode has been confirmed to have happened. That means somewhere behind the anonymized bride is a real 26-year-old woman, Karen Roston, who died 1 week into her marriage. The unnamed version is a smaller entry than the case it comes from, but it makes its own point. Even stripped of identity, the pattern holds firm and recognizable. A husband uses the perceived dangers of a honeymoon water sport as a cover for a deliberate killing. The name may vanish in the retelling, but the method does not, and neither does the fact that a real person's death sits underneath the story. Step back from the individual cases, and something colder comes into focus. It is not just that a handful of honeymooners died at sea. It is that the same setting, marketed relentlessly as the ultimate romantic escape, keeps turning up as the backdrop for killings across different decades and different ships. Researchers who traced the real cases behind the Cruise Ship Killers series found that several episodes were built on genuine honeymoon or newlywed deaths, and the pattern in those cases is the warning. The individuals in many of these summaries are not named, and the specific ships and dates are often left out. What survives is the recurring shape. newlyweds where one partner falls overboard under questionable circumstances, apparent accidental drownings that later show pre-mortem injuries, honeymoon disappearances where foul play is suspected but never proven. These are not one story told many ways. They are separate tragedies that happen to rhyme. Look at what they have in common, and the reasons come clear. There is isolation at sea, a ship surrounded by miles of water with no bystanders beyond the rail. There is limited camera coverage, especially on older vessels built before surveillance was standard. And there is the party atmosphere, the free-flowing alcohol, and the celebratory mood that blurs the line between a normal night and a night that ended in something no one can reconstruct. Combine those, and you get an environment where a violent partner or an opportunistic offender faces a reduced chance of being caught in the act or convicted afterwards. The aftermath tends to follow its own script, too. In many of these cases, the cruise line initially labels the incident an accident, and the family is left to fight for information and accountability. That was true for George Smith, whose family pushed for years and eventually saw the FBI re-review the case. It was true, in a different way, for the honeymoon deaths where a spouse's tidy account of a fall or a drowning had to be pulled apart by forensic evidence before anyone would call it what it was. Not all of them end in a conviction. Some of these episodes reference FBI or local law enforcement involvement, and, in cases like Adriana and Karen Roston, a conviction that named the killer. Others, like George Smith's disappearance and the older cases of Lynn Kaufman and Ruby, remain unsolved, the suspicion documented but the proof forever out of reach. That gap between suspicion and proof is the real subject of this episode. The honeymoon setting does not create violence, but it can shelter it, delaying detection until evidence is degraded and jurisdictions are tangled. The pattern is the point, and the point is that a place built for the safest, happiest days of a marriage has, again and again, hidden the opposite. This last one was not technically a honeymoon, but it belongs here because it shows the same confined space turning lethal on a trip that was supposed to be a celebration. Shirley McGill was 55 years old, from Winnetka, California, and the cruise was meant to mark her 55th birthday. In July 2009, she and her husband Robert boarded the Carnival cruise ship Elation for a 5-night Mexico itinerary. It was a milestone trip, the kind of round-number birthday that people save for and look forward to, a celebration at sea. Shirley had the ordinary hopes of anyone on a birthday cruise. Good weather, good food, a few days away with her husband to mark half a century, and a bit more of life. The ship offered all of it, the pools and the dining rooms and the sun off the water, the whole apparatus of a carnival holiday designed to feel like a treat. But the danger on this trip was not the sea or a stranger or a scuba tank. It was inside their own cabin. While they were on the cruise, Shirley and Robert fell into a heated argument in their room. As one account of the case records it, it was while the McGills were on their cruise that Shirley's husband beat and strangled her to death in their cruise ship cabin during a heated argument. In the small, enclosed space of a stateroom, an argument became a killing. Shirley was found dead. Unlike so many of the older cases, this one did not hinge on ambiguous evidence or a staged scene. Robert McGill admitted responsibility and was arrested. He confessed to the murder, and he was later convicted and given a life sentence for killing his wife on the cruise. The irony is quieter than the staged dives and the mysterious overboards, but no less grim. There was no ocean to blame, no current, no fall from a balcony. There was only a cabin door, and behind it a confined space that hid extreme domestic violence in the middle of a trip bought to celebrate a life. The very intimacy of the cruise cabin, the thing that makes it feel private and safe, was what let the violence happen out of anyone's sight. Shirley McGill was 55, marking a birthday on a ship in the sun, when the celebration ended inside her own room. Her case rounds out a hard truth that runs through every story in this episode. The threat on these voyages was rarely the water. It was, again and again, the person closest to the victim, in the one space where no one else was watching. George Allen Smith IV was 26 years old, newly married, and exactly where a young couple dreams of being. He and his wife, Jennifer Hagel Smith, had boarded Royal Caribbean's Brilliance of the Seas for a Mediterranean honeymoon cruise, the kind of trip you save for, the kind you plan around. On the night of the 4th of July, 2005, with the ship anchored off Kushadasi, on Turkey's Aegean coast, the newlyweds spent their evening the way many honeymooners do. They visited the casino. They visited the bars. They drank, and they drank heavily, in a crowd of other young passengers. What happened in the hours after midnight is where the story turns from ordinary celebration into something investigators are still unable to fully explain. Around 4 a.m, Jennifer was found passed out in a corridor. Crew took her to the ship's infirmary, then back to the couple's cabin, where she eventually woke. Alone, George was not there. Later that morning, passengers and crew noticed something on the canopy of a lifeboat hanging below the Smiths' balcony cabin, a large bloodstain. George Smith was gone. He has never been found. When the ship reached Kushadasi, Turkish authorities boarded. George was presumed to have gone overboard during the night, but that single phrase, "gone overboard," hid a tangle of questions that would consume years. The case sat across jurisdictions that barely fit together. A ship under a foreign flag, in Turkish waters, carrying American passengers. Turkish police investigated. The FBI investigated. U.S. congressional committees eventually got involved. Royal Caribbean initially suggested George had likely fallen while drunk, but the bloodstain on the lifeboat, the conflicting witness accounts, and reports of missing items pointed somewhere darker. The FBI looked at the possibility of robbery and assault by other young men who had been partying with George that night. After years of work, the Bureau closed the case without filing any criminal charges. No one was ever held responsible. Royal Caribbean later settled civil claims, with both Jennifer and George's family under confidential terms, with the company maintaining there was no evidence of murder. And so the manner of death remains, officially, undetermined, a blank space where an answer should be. What George's disappearance did change was the law. His family campaigned, and their grief became one of the driving forces behind the Cruise Vessel Security and Safety Act of 2010, which required better reporting of serious incidents at sea, higher railings, and improved surveillance. There is a hard irony in that. A honeymoon cruise, sold as the safest possible way to see the world, ended up exposing just how little legal protection a passenger had if they simply vanished in the night. George Smith got on a ship to begin his married life. He never got off it, and the people who loved him never got the truth. If you're already sitting with how easily an ordinary celebration can turn, you're not alone. Subscribe and stay with me through the rest. It was Christmas Eve, 2010, and the cruise ship Costa Magica was in port at Tortola, in the British Virgin Islands. For the passengers aboard, the day promised exactly the kind of postcard memory a Caribbean cruise is built to sell. A scenic island bus tour through Tortola's green, hilly interior, booked directly through Costa Cruises. Among those who climbed aboard the small, open-sided safari bus that morning was Cecilia Reyes, 24 years old, from San Juan, Puerto Rico. 21 cruise passengers in all set off from the dock in Road Town to ride the island's winding roads. Tortola is beautiful, but its roads are steep, narrow, and in places lacking guardrails entirely. The route climbed and dropped along ridges with sweeping views of the sea. And then, on a steep downhill section near Windy Hill, something went wrong with the bus. The driver, according to reports, lost control. The vehicle veered off the road, over an embankment, and dropped down a hillside. On an open-sided bus, there was nothing to hold a person in. Some passengers were thrown from the vehicle as it went over. Others were crushed or trapped in the wreckage as it came to rest on the slope below. The scenic drive had become a fall. 5 passengers died. 16 more were injured, several of them critically. Local police, firefighters, and bystanders scrambled to reach the wreck, and the injured were carried to Peebles Hospital in Roadtown. The Costa Magica stayed in port to help, and Costa Cruises arranged to fly families to the islands and to bring survivors home. The investigation that followed treated the crash as a road traffic collision, and the driver was later charged. In the magistrate's court, the allegations that emerged were chilling in their ordinariness: defective brakes and inadequate vehicle maintenance on a bus sent down some of the steepest roads on the island. Survivors said the vehicle had seemed to be moving too fast for the narrow, twisting road and the conditions. Here is the detail that sits at the center of this case. Cruise lines often market their own ship-sponsored excursions as the safer choice. Vetted, approved, trustworthy, compared with wandering off on your own. This was exactly that kind of tour. It was official. It was booked through the cruise line, and it used a vehicle that, the court would later hear, had brakes that allegedly could not be trusted to hold on a hill. The very thing that was supposed to guarantee safety, that stamp of approval, meant nothing when the brakes failed on the descent. 21 people boarded that bus, expecting a Christmas Eve they would talk about for years. 5 of them, including a 24-year-old woman a long way from home in Puerto Rico, never made it back to the ship. The tragedy left behind a hard question for the entire cruise industry. How carefully are these local operators actually vetted, and who is responsible when the trusted... Barbara Davy, known to those close to her as Bobby, was 63 years old, an American retiree and a passenger aboard Princess Cruises' Sea Princess. On the 3rd of January, 2006, the ship was in port at Rosso, the capital of Dominica, and Barbara had signed up for one of the most relaxed excursions on offer, a river tubing trip down the Layou River, sold by the cruise line as a gentle, family-friendly float through tropical scenery. This was not advertised as an adventure for the brave. River tubing of this kind is marketed precisely to passengers who want to enjoy the jungle without effort or risk. You sit in an individual inner tube, the current carries you, and local guides keep watch. No swimming skill required. It is the sort of outing a retiree picks specifically because it sounds easy. But the Layou River was not its usual gentle self that day. Recent rains had swollen it, and the water was reportedly running higher and faster than normal. The same rains that kept Dominica's rainforest lush and green had also raised the river that the tour was about to float down. As the group drifted downstream, Barbara's tube became caught in turbulent water or struck rocks, the river overwhelming a craft that was never meant for fast current. She was thrown from her tube and separated from it, and she disappeared under the water. Guides moved quickly to reach her, attempting a rescue in the rushing river. They pulled Barbara out, but she was unresponsive. Efforts to resuscitate her failed, and she was pronounced dead. A gentle float through paradise had become a drowning. Princess Cruises notified the passengers still aboard and worked with local authorities to assist her family. Dominican officials opened an inquiry, and the early reports pointed to the obvious culprit: strong currents, and a question about whether anyone had adequately assessed the river's condition before sending tourists onto it. There is no widely available formal accident report, but travel industry coverage afterward noted that some river tubing operators adjusted their protocols in the wake of the death. The case left behind a difficult question about responsibility. When weather changes the conditions, when a calm river becomes a fast one overnight, whose job is it to look at the water, recognize the danger, and cancel the trip? A passenger like Barbara had no way to assess a swollen river. She trusted that someone had, that the word gentle on the excursion description still applied that morning. The cruel symmetry of it is hard to miss. The very rain that made the scenery worth coming to see had turned the easy float into something it was never built to survive. Barbara Davy came to Dominica to relax, and the safest sounding outing on the list was the one that took her life. Sarah Buffett was 44 years old, a Canadian from Ontario, and a passenger aboard the Carnival Victory. On the 28th of June, 2009, the ship called at Roatan Island, off the coast of Honduras, and Sarah had booked one of its most popular thrill excursions through Carnival, a zip-line course through the jungle canopy at Gumbalimba Park, advertised as the chance to soar safely above the trees. The appeal of an excursion like this is the height. You are strapped into a harness, clipped to a steel cable, and sent gliding high above the forest floor, the canopy rushing beneath you. The whole thrill of it depends on a simple, rigid set of rules, the kind every zip-line operation is built around. You wait until the line ahead of you is clear. You rely on the braking system to slow you safely at the platform. You rely on staff to space the riders so that no two people are ever moving on the same cable toward each other. What happened to Sarah, according to witnesses, was a failure of exactly those safeguards. During the course, she reportedly became stuck or slowed on a cable, and a guide or another rider followed behind her on that same line. The accounts describe a collision on the cable, an impact, or the loss of her grip that came with it, and Sarah fell. The drop was estimated at 30 to 40 feet, straight down to the ground below. She suffered severe trauma on impact. Staff at the park attempted to help her, and she was carried out, but she was pronounced dead from her injuries. Carnival confirmed the death of a Carnival Victory passenger during a zipline excursion at Roatan, and other guests booked on the same tour were told the news, with some excursions canceled. Honduran authorities opened an investigation into the incident and into the safety practices at the zipline park. Media reports raised pointed questions about the braking systems, the spacing between riders, and harness safety. Some witnesses alleged that staff had allowed riders to set off before the previous rider had reached the platform, the single thing those rules exist to prevent. Carnival said it was working with the local operator and the authorities, though detailed official findings were never widely published. The irony of this death is built into the attraction itself. The excursion sold the thrill of soaring safely above the forest. The word safely was doing all the work. It was the entire premise, and yet the fall came from the very height that was advertised as the reason to go. A collision on a cable, the exact scenario every protocol is meant to make impossible, sent a 44-year-old woman plummeting through the canopy she had come to admire from above. Sarah Buffett trusted the harness, the cable, and the people running the line. On Roatan that day, that trust was not enough. Alyssa Smalley was 28 years old, an American, and a passenger aboard the Carnival Triumph. On the 22nd of June, 2013, the ship was in port at Cabo San Lucas, on the southern tip of Mexico's Baja Peninsula, and Alyssa decided to do something most of us think of as harmless holiday fun. She went parasailing off Medano Beach, booking a tandem ride through a local operator, the kind of 5-minute thrill sold on every busy resort beach in the world. Parasailing looks gentle from the shore. You are lifted into the air beneath a colorful parachute towed behind a boat, drifting over the bay with the coastline spread out below you. It is the sort of activity people choose precisely because it feels safe. A brief, scenic float above the water, then back down. Alyssa and a companion went up together on the tandem ride that day. But shortly after takeoff, the conditions turned. Strong winds reportedly blew in, and what happened next was captured on video by people watching from the beach. The line connecting the parasail to the towboat snapped or detached, with nothing holding it down. The parachute did not settle gently into the water as it should have. Instead, caught by the gusts, it stayed aloft, and it began to drag. The wind hauled Alyssa at high speed toward the shore, along the beachfront, and into the buildings that line it. She was slammed into structures and the ground as the parachute was buffeted along the coastline, while bystanders filmed the horrifying sequence, unable to do anything to stop it. Emergency responders reached her on the beach and rushed her to a local hospital in Cabo, but she was pronounced dead from multiple traumatic injuries. Her companion on the tandem ride survived, seriously hurt. Carnival confirmed that a Carnival Triumph passenger had died parasailing while ashore in Cabo. Mexican authorities and the local port captain's office examined whether the operator had been monitoring the weather and properly maintaining the equipment. The reports centered on two things: the sudden shift in wind and a possible equipment failure, the breakage of the tow line, or an improperly rigged harness or line setup. The case drew attention to how lightly some water sports operators in popular cruise ports are regulated. The rules of the activity are not complicated. Parasailing operators are supposed to suspend rides when the winds pick up and to inspect their tow lines and harnesses before sending anyone into the air. On that day, the ride went ahead as conditions worsened and the line did not hold. There is a particular cruelty in where it ended. The crowded beach beside the cruise tender dock is the kind of place travelers treat as a safe playground, a few steps from the ship. Alyssa Smalley boarded a parachute for a few minutes of fun over the bay, and the wind and a failed line turned that brief thrill into a fatal drag along the concrete shoreline, in full view of a beach full of people. On the 6th of April, 2010, cruise ships from Carnival, Princess, and other lines were in port at St. Thomas, in the U.S. Virgin Islands and their passengers were doing what cruise passengers do in St. Thomas, taking in the island on an open-air safari bus tour. These vehicles are part of the scenery there, converted trucks fitted with open bench seating, iconic enough to appear in the tour brochures themselves. The open sides are the whole appeal. Nothing comes between you and the view of the harbor below. That morning, one of these safari buses, loaded with cruise passengers on a sightseeing tour, was descending Mafali Hill, a steep, winding road that overlooks Charlotte Amalie and the cruise ships moored in the harbor. It is one of the classic scenic overlooks on the island, the kind of view that ends up framed on a wall back home. On the descent, the driver lost control. Witnesses and investigators would later point to the same cause heard so often on these island roads: brake failure and excessive speed coming down the grade. The bus struck a wall or another vehicle and then overturned or left the roadway. And on a vehicle with open sides and bench seating, the result was exactly what those open sides invite. Passengers were thrown from the bus. At least 2 cruise passengers were killed, and more than a dozen were injured. Emergency services carried the victims to Roy L. Schneider Hospital on St. Thomas, while the cruise lines worked on medical evacuations and the grim task of notifying families. Sources differ on which of the victims were publicly named, and where the record is unclear. The people lost deserve not to have details invented around them. What is certain is that they were tourists who had come ashore for a postcard view and did not come back. The U.S. Virgin Islands Police Department and local transportation authorities investigated, and officials later stated that the bus had defective brakes and was not in proper mechanical condition to carry passengers on such steep grades. The crash renewed scrutiny of how these open safari buses are converted and regulated, with calls for stricter inspections of the vehicles before they were trusted with loads of tourists on the island's near vertical roads. The irony here is woven into the design of the tour itself. The open sides that make the safari bus such a beloved way to see St. Thomas, that give riders the unobstructed view of the sea and the ships, are also the very thing that leaves them exposed, with nothing to keep them inside when a vehicle overturns. And the route they were on was no remote back road. It was the classic scenic descent, the one chosen for the panorama of the harbor and the cruise ships waiting below. The same view that put it in the brochures became the backdrop to a mass casualty crash, with the ships those passengers had sailed in on sitting in the water far beneath them. Jordan Lindsay was 21 years old, from Torrance, California, and she was on a family cruise vacation aboard Royal Caribbean's Harmony of the Seas. On the 26th of June, 2019, the ship was in port at Nassau, in the Bahamas, and Jordan went out on a snorkeling excursion to the Rose Island area, near a spot known as Jaws Beach. It was the kind of outing families choose for its simplicity. Clear, warm water, close to shore, no special skill required. This was not a shark dive. It was not an extreme adventure billed with warnings and waivers about predators. It was a snorkel. Jordan entered the water while her parents stayed nearby, on shore and close to the boat. The ordinary arrangement of a family day out. Parents watching from a few yards away while their daughter floated above the reef. Around 2 in the afternoon, multiple sharks attacked her in the water. Bahamian officials identified them as likely tiger sharks. From shore, her parents saw the danger before she did. Her father later described the moment to the media in words no parent should ever have to say. "We screamed, 'Get out of the water,' but she couldn't hear us. She did not hear, or could not react in time, and the sharks reached her." The injuries were catastrophic. Jordan was pulled from the water and brought by boat back toward Nassau, then taken to Princess Margaret Hospital, where she was pronounced dead. The autopsy cited severe shark bite trauma. Royal Caribbean confirmed that a guest from Harmony of the Seas had died during an independent shore excursion. The Royal Bahamas Police Force investigated. Authorities noted that there were no lifeguards present and that the tour had not been directly operated by the cruise line. One of those independent excursions, a passenger books on their own time in port. Officials described it as an extremely rare but confirmed fatal shark attack in Bahamian waters. In the coverage that followed, commentators pointed out how easily excursions that promise swimming or snorkeling with marine life can blur the line between a controlled interaction and the genuine risk of the open ocean. That is the quiet warning at the heart of this case. Jordan was not somewhere reckless. She was on a placid, clear water snorkel near a popular shore on one of the most visited cruise routes in the world. Travel advisories do mention, in their dry way, that sharks inhabit Bahamian waters, but those words land differently when you are standing on a sunny beach watching your daughter swim. The tragedy underlined something cruise passengers rarely let themselves think about. The gentle blue water beside a postcard beach is still wild ocean, with everything that lives in it. A 21-year-old went for a swim a few yards from her parents, and they had to watch from the sand, screaming a warning she could not hear. Jenna Lee Russell was 24 years old, from New York, and she was on her honeymoon. She and her husband, Travis Layer, had boarded Norwegian Cruise Line's Norwegian Pearl to celebrate their marriage, and on the 20th of June, 2015, the ship called at Roatan Island, Honduras, the same island, the same kind of jungle canopy, the same kind of attraction. The couple booked a zip-line excursion at a course marketed as an extreme canopy adventure, the sort of shared thrill newlyweds choose to make a honeymoon unforgettable. The promise of these courses is a memory made together. 2 people, side by side in the trees, gliding over the forest. And the single rule that keeps that promise from becoming dangerous is almost universal in the industry. Only one rider on a span of cable at a time. The whole system of braking and timing depends on it. According to Honduran officials, that is the rule that failed. Jenna and Travis were riding the zip line on the same cable. Travis became stuck partway along the line, unable to clear it, and then Jenna was sent after him, down the same span, before he was out of the way. She collided with her husband at speed. The impact caused severe trauma to both of them. Staff brought the couple down from the line and rushed them toward medical care, but Jenna was pronounced dead at a local hospital. Travis survived, badly hurt, broken ribs and other serious injuries. Norwegian Cruise Line confirmed the death of a Norwegian Pearl passenger on the zipline excursion at Roatan and said the excursion had been suspended while the investigation proceeded. Honduran authorities examined whether the operator had violated safety procedures by allowing a second rider onto the line before it was clear. The reporting described the operator as a local company used by multiple cruise lines and raised the same questions that had surfaced after other incidents at Roatan. The quality of training, the reliability of the braking systems, and the protocols for what to do when a rider gets stuck on the cable. Norwegian said it was cooperating with local officials and reviewing its relationship with the tour operator. The cruelty of this case is in its symmetry with everything the day was meant to be. The whole point of an extreme zip line on a honeymoon is to share the rush together, to feel it side by side. Jenna and Travis got that, in the most terrible way imaginable. The adventure meant to bind them in a shared memory instead sent them crashing into each other in midair, because the most basic rule of the activity was broken. A husband stuck on a cable, a wife sent after him too soon, and a honeymoon that ended with one of them gone. They went looking for a thrill to remember. What they got was the kind of moment that the rules of ziplining exist, above all else, to prevent. If these stayed with you, the stories in the next video are even harder to make sense of. You can click the video on your screen to keep watching right now. Until the next one, take care of yourselves out there.